hosted by the South Asian Journalists Association, of which I am proud to serve on the board. And I am Karen Mahabir, and I'm the fact check and misinformation editor for the Associated Press in New York, where I oversee our fact checking work, misinformation stories, and online verification efforts. And I'm really happy to be joined today by Jane of BuzzFeed, who is one of the foremost reporters on disinformation, cybersecurity, and online investigations. And we wanted to have this session because this is really an issue that affects so many people. I can tell you that since we entered the pandemic a year ago, and even before the virus began moving across the globe, we in the newsrooms have been inundated with false claims and conspiracy theories about the virus and its origins, as well as a number of bogus remedies for coronavirus that we've had to debunk, often quickly, because sometimes it can lead to real harm or danger. And, you know, it's one thing when you're countering misinformation that comes from anonymous sources or people that you just don't know or know very well. But when it's coming from your family members and your friends whom you love and you care about, it can become much more of a sensitive issue to address, particularly if those friends and family members are people that you're really close to and who you see and talk to often. So I think one thing that's important to keep in mind when you are having to address some of this misinformation is that not all of it is being shared with bad intention. Sometimes it's because somebody may not know better, or maybe they don't have access to accurate information, or they don't know how to go about finding that accurate information. Or, and this is often the case, it's being shared by somebody who doesn't know if the information is accurate or not, but figures, well, I better share this anyway, just in case. And a lot of time that misinformation is being shared in small and closed groups, like perhaps on WhatsApp or a group text message or a Facebook group, where you have a greater likelihood of trusting that person because maybe you share a common experience or a common culture or language. So to kick off the session, what we wanted to do is first explain the difference between misinformation and disinformation and how and why it's shared, and the different kinds of misinformation. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how you can do your own research on claims so that you can advise others. And then finally, we're going to end on some tips that you can take away on how to have these discussions with your friends and family. And I should note that while a lot of what we're going to talk about is focused on misinformation around the coronavirus, a lot of this can also be applied to misinformation just like on any topic. So if you have any questions as we're going along, just drop a note in the chat and we'll try to get to it. And Jane is going to kick us off here on the first slide.
All right. Hi. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's like Karen noted, this is a difficult topic, and that's why we sort of wanted to start with explaining how we're thinking about mis and disinformation and sort of providing some base knowledge so that you're well equipped to speak to anyone in your life about it. So when we study false information, there are a few different types of information that we look at. The one that I'll start with is malinformation, which is real information taken out of context or miscontextualized, specifically with the intent to harm. So think of something like a video taken out of context and posted with a different caption. That happens all the time. That's a great example of malinformation. Disinformation is either false or decontextualized information that once again has the intent to harm. And that intent is really important because very frequently the people who share the false information, the people who create the false information, do have that intent. They do have that intent to cause harm, whether that's to individual communities, to people, to populations, but the people who further spread that information, they spread misinformation because they don't have the intent to harm. Very frequently, people pass on rumors just as a way of safeguarding against something that may be happening in the news, or as a way of passing on information that may or may not be useful. And that's what we mean when we say misinformation. That's accidentally or mistakenly shared false information. So that's sort of how we're thinking in terms of the problem. But on the next slide here, we'll also see some of the ways in which false information is amplified. Most frequently, it comes through the anonymous web. These are closed spaces, or those kind of sketchy websites like 4chan or 8chan that we've all heard so much about. And then it moves to closed networks, so generally group chats, or really like closed Facebook groups, anything like that, where organization can take place. But what we do see is a lot of pickup from conspiracy communities, especially over the last year, which then amplify that information to more mainstream social media. So one great example is last May, there was a 30-minute video called Plandemic that started out on closed networks that was shared to closed Facebook groups. Those Facebook groups then shared it to conspiracy-focused communities, communities that oppose vaccination science, communities that support then President Donald Trump, communities who were big supporters of the QAnon conspiracy theory. And then the people in those groups pushed it towards the more mainstream social media, putting it into timelines of their friends and family who then watched the video and may have found it convincing. And of course, we can't ignore the fact that professional media often plays a huge role in amplification of false messages. And that's sort of where we as reporters try to think through how do we write about false information? How do we not write about false information? And finally, the last slide I wanted to show you. All of these slides, by the way, are from First Draft, a fantastic organization that fights against disinformation. But this final slide I wanted to show you deals with the different types of misleading content that we see on the web. Some of it is pretty low harm, right? This is something like an Onion headline being taken as if it's serious, even though it's not. Or somebody accidentally sort of making a false connection between articles. But a lot of it is quite dangerous, including fabricated content, which is 100% false, or manipulated content when we talk about. So when we talk about mis and disinformation, it's quite important to highlight and understand the type of false content that we're looking for before we even approach the conversation with the people around us. And that's because we need to be able to gather as much information as possible and explain why we think something is false, so that we have a strong basis for having that conversation. And finally, I wanted to show you the slide from Pointer about the way that false information travels around the globe. So I don't know how many of you remember one of the early coronavirus hoaxes that if you hold your breath for 10 seconds, that means you don't have coronavirus. That was something that got passed around a lot in WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups. It got copied and pasted across social media. And on its face, it sort of seemed kind of ridiculous, right? Like, you probably can't tell if you have the coronavirus or not just by holding your breath. But that was at a time when so little information was available about the coronavirus and the way it works, that it seemed a believable enough hoax to spread it. So Pointer tracked the spread of this hoax and showed that from the beginning, from early March, when the hoax began spreading in the US, it immediately in the following days and weeks made its way around the globe. So the prevalence of this false information is vast. It transcends languages, it transcends borders, it transcends geography, and really spreads around the world with really intense speed, which is why when we talk about disinformation and sort of understanding the problem, a big part is understanding how prevalent and accessible false information is, not just in the US and the English language, but globally.
Great, thanks, Jane. So as Jane mentioned, misinformation can travel just so quickly. And we wanted to highlight this example because it's one of the better ones we have of an instance in which bad information was being shared fast. And when I say shared, I can tell you personally that this particular text message on an impending national lockdown was sent to me by so many people, including friends and family, who were messaging me to find out if this was true and what steps they should take. And what set this bit of misinformation apart from others that we've seen is that it was the way that it was being shared, right? It wasn't something that just, popped up in one of my feeds. I mean, it did, but it was shared by text message, which really gave it so much of a more of a personal feel. And there were so many forms of this message. And it basically said that a friend or relative who was working in the government had learned there would be a national lockdown and that people would not be able to leave their homes for weeks. And at the time, and this was in March of last year, there was so much fear in the atmosphere about the virus, which was really spreading fast. And fear is something that can be one of the biggest drivers of mis and disinformation. And also this did not seem so completely out of the realm of possibility. And all of that gave it so much more sharing power. And of course, this was not true. And both Jane and my reporters at the AP wrote stories debunking it. And officials came out to try to address the misinformation and to quell any potential it had for creating panic. And of course, it was also during this time that we saw a number of claims about fake remedies for the virus start to crop up. There were just so many. And so here is just a sample of some of the claims that we debunked at the AP, all within a single week in April of last year. And I should mention that many of the claims that we saw circulating, these claims in particular, were circulating in both English and in Spanish. So claims like eating alkaline foods will stave off the coronavirus because the coronavirus has a pH level of 5.5 to 8.5, which was false. The coronavirus does not have a pH level, and eating these foods would not prevent someone from being infected with COVID-19 because the body's pH levels cannot be changed through diet. And we saw this false post just really traveling with a list of foods that were said to be in that pH range, like lemons and limes and pineapples, but even the pH levels that were provided for those fruits were also wrong. And for anyone interested, lemons and limes have a pH level of around 2. Also, like drinking alcoholic beverages or hot water with lemon and baking soda can cure you of the virus, or that this antibiotic ointment will kill off the germs that you breathe and then prevent the virus from infecting your lungs. And I can see Jane kind of shaking her head because I'm sure she's seen all of these too. And then there were even more serious claims like drinking bleach or ingesting chloroquine phosphate, which is an additive used to clean fish tanks, which did in fact lead to a man's death in Arizona. And again, this was a time when people really wanted answers, and this is what we tend to see happen. Yeah, when there's a void of information and accurate information, it creates an opening for misinformation to step in. And that, when people are worried or they're scared and they just want an answer, any answer, something to hold on to. So if you find yourself being confronted with material from friends and family members that you suspect isn't true, and you're not a fact checker and you're a misinformation reporter like Jane and I, then there are some basic things that you can do on your own to verify material, and you can teach that to others. So, Jane's going to go over some of the tips and explain what is known as the SIFT method.
So the SIFT method was developed by a researcher named Michael Caulfield, who has been looking at misinformation and especially education around misinformation for a very long time. I really like this method because, first of all, it's very simple and teachable, but it's also very active, right? Right now, we're talking about one-off pieces of misinformation, but of course, together, some of them combine to form some disturbing beliefs or some disturbing conspiratorial beliefs. And I think that this method, in part, helps address that. So the first thing to do when you see a piece of false information is to stop. This can feel a little bit counterintuitive for the information environment that we're in. And that's because the social media networks that we're on are designed to keep us moving, to keep us scrolling, to keep us looking for new content. So that pause is really, really important. The other reason why that pause is important is because, as Karen mentioned, the emotional appeal of falling for misinformation cannot be overstated. When we're anxious, when we're pissed off, all of that really makes us more likely to fall for a piece of false information. The next step is to investigate the source. And that's when you can really start looking at, okay, who is the person that's making the claim? Or what do I know about the institution that's making the claim? And are they credible? So if it's a social media account, does that person have the expertise in the subject matter? Does that person have credibility in the subject matter? Or is this something that they're sort of passing on either for online clout or because they weren't sure previously that this is false? If it's a news website, try to go to the About page to see who they are and what their mission statement is. Or go to the front page and make sure that they're covering a varied amount of news. So very frequently with hyper-partisan or misleading news websites, what we see is on the front page, it's all very one-tone coverage, right? All blaring headlines, all very emotionally charged images. If you go to the homepage of AP or BuzzFeed or the New York Times or the Washington Post, right? A lot of the headlines are actually pretty boring and very procedural. So that's a good way to know that you're looking at a reliable or unreliable source. Of course, the next step should be to find better coverage. People tend to think that social media is sort of the internet, right? That's what the internet is, but of course it's not. We have plenty of resources. We could look things up on Wikipedia, we could look things up on Google, we could look things up in research papers. So the next step should be to open up a search engine and say, okay, what else can I find on this subject? Has anybody else written about it? Has anybody else covered it from a different angle? And once you do that, just trace those claims, trace those quotes back to their original context. If you're looking at 2 or 3 different articles, look at who are the people who are being given voices in those articles. Are there any reliable experts? Are those experts real? How do the headlines differ? How do the first paragraphs of these articles differ? And all of that will sort of help you gain more context for what you're looking for. So the SIFT method, very easy to teach and highly recommended as a way to identify and debunk false information for yourself and maybe to teach to people around you as a way to combat against false information.
Great, thank you, Jane. Okay, so we wanted to be sure that we offered a lot of tips to everyone about this. And so we're going to start with interpersonal tips on just how to actually have this conversation with friends and family members. And the first thing, and this is what I tell myself, is I would advise is to just stay calm. Sometimes it can be it can be jarring when a friend or family member shares misinformation. But it's really very important to just stay calm and to be gentle and to be non-confrontational when you're approaching that person or if you're responding to their messaging. It's also a really good idea not to publicly shame the person. Why? Because this almost always backfires. It pushes them away, and then you're not able to engage in conversation with them in which you could be helping. It's if you can, it's a good idea to communicate by phone. Not in a group text message, for example, and certainly not like on a public platform, but really just try to take the person aside. I think also it's very important to think about the person who did share the material, and ask yourself and ask them too why they did, what led them to share this or to believe this material, and also where did they find it? How did it get to them? And try to think through their experience and maybe even their past experiences, like what led them to this point, what led them here. And lastly, I would say, don't expect for one conversation to change everything. Change does not happen overnight, especially when people have very ingrained beliefs. So it's really important to just try to engage as much as you can and to keep talking to that person, and just kind of keep them in your fold. Um, so just some interpersonal tips, and we had so many that we broke them down into three groupings. So Jane is now going to go over some education tips. Oh, Jane, I think you're muted.
Yep. I see it. Classic. Yeah, so like Karen said, a lot of this stuff takes patience, and there's no silver bullet to having these kinds of conversations. So definitely don't expect that change overnight. But do sort of commit to the project, right? Commit to sending the person resources and maybe exposing them to further evidence. And again, do this in a way that seems almost casual, even if you don't feel casual about it. Say, oh, I heard what you said, or I saw what you said the other day, and came across this. What do you think of it? So that way you're able to give them a little bit of room to respond with dignity, to respond with curiosity, and to answer questions rather than dig their heels in. Encourage the person to subscribe to legitimate news outlets, Facebook pages, and WhatsApp channels. So one of the biggest problems that we see is, especially with older generations, but also younger, like everybody, it's not an exception. People don't necessarily build themselves a social media environment where they have easy access to news and accurate information. So if this is the case where you're talking to a family member who maybe isn't very familiar with the way social media networks are structured, it's a good idea to show them how to subscribe to legitimate news sources, how to subscribe to AP, BBC, like whatever, whatever, any local news outlets that may be relevant to them. Because very frequently those are not immediately in the news feeds of the people who are falling for false information. And to that end, spend some time explaining how technology functions if the people you're speaking with don't understand that. So by this, I mean, many people in my life don't necessarily understand how Facebook makes decisions on what it's showing its users in the news feed, right? Especially many of my elderly family members, they don't understand that just because something is on Facebook and looks like a news outlet and is in their news feed doesn't mean that it isn't news. So it's really important to not just send them these accurate stories and not just surround them with accurate information to the best of your ability, but also as much as you can, explain how this technology works, what algorithms are, what Facebook groups are, what group chats are, so that they understand that sometimes this technology can be used maliciously, and anybody can become a target of that malicious use.
Great. We also had some tips on community building. So Jane, do you want to start off, and then I can fill in and take over?
Yeah, sure thing. So, the one thing that we really want to reiterate is no matter how sort of committed the person you're speaking to is to the false ideas around them, don't cease contact unless, of course, there's a real and present danger to your physical well being. And that's because if the person wants to sort of have a lifeline back to maybe out of isolation, or back to the friendships that they may have lost if they are really far down the rabbit hole, they're going to need that lifeline. And it can be incredibly difficult to reach out to people who have cut you off and say, hi, I really need your help. But if you're a person that's already there, that becomes much, much easier. So to the best of your ability, again, unless there's a real and present danger, do stay in the person's life. Um, and be a resource for others. Post to your own social media tips about media literacy, sources of accurate information, and skills for recognizing misinformation. So, for example, one of the things that I do is if I see a piece of false information, I take the time to explain how I broke it down and how I figured out that it was a piece of false information and the questions that remain for me. And I think what that does is it teaches people the thought process of verification. It teaches people to use that SIFT method, right? And see it in action rather than in concept. And Karen, do you want to take it from here?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So form communities to share strategies and for support. And, this is something that can really happen organically. In my office, which is currently consists of computer screens and Zoom meetings, we do talk about the misinformation that we see coming from friends and family. And sometimes we use it and we debunk that material. We get a lot of tips from friends and family members, but we do spend time talking about the ways in which we try to address something, whether it was sending that person material or directing them to accurate sources of information on the internet, like whether it's the World Health Organization or the CDC, pointing them to articles that we have written that can help clarify some of this material, and just really kind of talking through just the ways in which we were able to reach someone. And this is an ongoing conversation, and you can, and I think in certain family and friend networks, if you can find somebody who is willing to be your ally in this, then you have an even stronger approach to helping your uncle or your aunt or whoever it may be, your teenage daughter, understand the reality of what's happening. So it's something that we talk about a lot, is how do we get that fact-based information to people in their hands. um, and I think it's also important to remember that, we're in a pandemic, and we're all dealing with so much, a lot of fear, a lot of insecurity, a lot of boredom, a lot of time spent behind screens and idle time, and it's something that we're all going through together. So again, and I mention this because it hits back to this idea that you never want to make anyone feel bad for sharing something that could be misinformation. Just bring them in. And lastly, just along with that idea, it's really important to give your family members and your friends some grace. Just remember and remind yourself to do that, and do it for yourself too. And this is a little bit off topic, but I just feel really strongly strongly about this now that we're coming up to the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic in the next few weeks. So that is what Jane and I had to say, and we are happy to take some questions. Here's our contact information, as well as some information on SAJA. Also, if anyone has any thoughts for other topics that you'd like to see SAJA focus on, whether or not it's related to misinformation, you can always drop me a line. You can reach out to Jane individually as well, or to any of the board members on SAJA through the site or on Twitter. So there.
Okay, we have some questions. Would it be helpful for me to read them, or what would be helpful, Karen?
Yeah, why don't you read them out and we'll take them.
So our first question is from a fellow board member, Pia. How do you stop the spread of misinformation when it happens in the moment, like in a conversation, when you're not in a position to immediately investigate the claims? For instance, I would not be able to counter the argument about pH levels on the spot, even though it sounds wrong.
Do you want to start, Jane, and I can fill in? Let's just share everything.
Yeah. I mean, that's always the tricky one, right? Because you don't want to be the person who's like grinding the conversation to a halt and be like, whoa, everybody, hang on a sec. Let's talk about what a pH level means, right? But you could be, there's a few, a lot of it kind of depends on the moment and the moment that you're in, especially if it's an in-person conversation, making a joke, not at the expense of the person who shared the false information, but sort of making a joke or a little bit of humor or lightness can really help. Or again, following up with a question of like, oh, that's not something that I've heard. Like, what makes you think that pH levels affect this thing? And maybe that will make the argument sort of fall apart. Usually fall apart pretty quickly if you do that. Or the third option would be to sort of shelve it and address it later and go back and say, hey, actually, I was thinking about those pH levels that you were talking about because I thought that was such a curious concept. But it turns out here's what this actually means. Isn't that wild, right? And I think it's always helpful, at least for me personally, to sort of like treat this question as a genuine question, even if to you it feels ridiculous, and treat the answer as a discovery or something like interesting and fascinating, rather than something stark, because I think that both opens up the conversation and kind of lightens the moment a little bit.
I think that is absolutely the most perfect response. And I would just add to that of course, I wouldn't know how to beat down a claim about pH levels if I was just confronted with it in conversation. But Jane's answers are perfect. And I will say that there have been times when I have sort of left the room and did a little Googling and then came back with a little bit more of an informed answer. And the places that I would go to would just be like the World Health Organization or the CDC to kind of to do some checking and some researching.
Lynn brings up the fact that, which is actually an investigation that I worked on with Karen about this idea that there are certain countries to blame for the origin of the coronavirus and that level of disinformation and misinformation. So she says, who is run by Chinese, an example of what I've been told when referring people to credible sources. So yeah, I'm guessing her question or statement is like, how do you try to convince people of these theories that have been around from the beginning of the virus's spread?
Well, actually, I think the challenge that I face is when I give references like, the CDC says this or Dr. Fausti says this, I almost feel like, it feels like people have been indoctrinated that these are all bad sources of information. These are actually the fake news. So I don't really know how to counteract that. If, well, my news is correct. Your sources are wrong.
This is a problem, absolutely. And I mean, I would say that, the best thing that you can do is just kind of use some of the guidance that we provided here about just talking them through the problem. I find that in conversations like that, when I start to really explore what's behind that sentiment, that's when you start to, as Jane said, it starts to kind of really fall apart. Just ask a lot of questions and stay on top of it. But I think you also have to figure out or come to a point in yourself where you realize I probably am not going to get very far with this. I can try as hard as I can, but I mean, there are just some people who cannot be convinced. And this has been going on for a very long time. I mean, Farnoosh referenced this disinformation project that we worked on. We worked on it over the course of about a year. And people who have been believing this kind of material for that long, it's really entrenched. And it can be very, very difficult to shake that, to shake that idea away from somebody. So, I mean, my advice in that situation would just be to keep talking to that person, keep pointing them to accurate sources of information, and just do your best. Jane, I don't know if you wanted to add a bit there.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things. I mean, I think one of the things is if this is somebody who you're really invested to sort of convince them that this isn't the case, the first step is to educate yourself. And by that, I mean, okay, where did this claim sort of come from? And what have been some of the counter arguments that already exist against it? So that you sort of you understand both the origin, but you also understand, okay, here, the actual facts. And the other thing I'll say is people who are that entrenched, one of the key things is to find any kind of common ground. One of the things you can say is, I don't know if I agree with that statement. I want to be transparent with you, but I do understand criticisms of the World Health Organization's handlings of that. What do you think of that? And sort of start finding common ground on real facts, and then maybe see where you diverge. And that divergence will give you a little bit more information of, okay, here's the area that I think I maybe need to work on, because a lot of the conspiracies that are this entrenched, they come from real concerns, right? Real fears. And I think that's true for the coronavirus, but that's true in a wider context as well. So right now we're seeing a lot of vaccine hesitancy, and for good reason, right? Because most people have not had very good experiences with the healthcare system, right? So in that case, that could be another way that you find common ground of like, yeah, you're right. A lot of people have been treated horribly by the healthcare system in this way, but here's where I think we diverge. So try to find that common ground and then try to sort of hold their hand and lead them back to at least a fact-based reality, and see what that can do for you. It's really a long road, unfortunately. No silver bullet answers here.
Nafisa asks, are you seeing disinfo specifically targeting the elderly to be skeptical of the vaccine?
Kind of. I mean, it's really tricky to figure out which audiences are being targeted by misinfo and disinfo unless they're specifically mentioned. And I think that's because the social media networks that the disinformation mainly lives on kind of aren't very upfront with their data. So we can't 100% say like, yes, this piece of false information is targeted at elderly people, right? Like this piece of false information is targeted at women, whatever. But we do know that I think, oh man, maybe a 2018 or 19 Princeton study looked at the people who fall for false information on Facebook specifically. And that study found that the older you are, the more likely you are to fall for false information. So I guess it's a little bit of a roundabout way to say yes, because false information will exist and older people will fall for that false information. But I also think that that frame can be a little bit dangerous because it makes us feel like we're not vulnerable to false information, or other populations are invulnerable to false information, and we all are. It's not exclusive to any one type of population. So that's my sort of yes but no kind of answer.
There's a few questions that kind of all are on the same topic of like pretty much asking like how much of this issue surrounding the coronavirus is mistrust of media sources or lack of news literacy, and how much of it is actually like a disinformation, misinformation campaign that is obviously, you know, rocketed in volume in the past year.
Karen, you want to take this one?
I was trying to find my mute button. I think it's hard to say. I think that it is, I think there is definitely, we can say that there is, you know, larger amounts of distrust in traditional media sources. And I think, you know, the media industry is going through, I would say, a period of transition, which is, you know, there's a lot more niche outlets and that sort of thing. We have certainly seen a lot of outlets that are pushing misinformation gain a lot of traction. And so I think it's hard to kind of distinguish, you know, where that feeling is coming from. I mean, I think Jane and I, you know, try as hard as we can to really capture disinformation networks that where we can actually say, yes, this is misinformation that is being pushed with the intent to deceive. And that's a strong thing to say, really. But, you know, I think we both work with, in our own research, and we work with outside groups to kind of get to that. But I think, you know, studies will show that there is a declining amount of trust in the media, and especially traditional media. But I think figuring out why exactly is really tricky.
One thing I'll add is studies into news deserts, so places where there's little to no local news, have shown that people look online to social media networks for information instead, which of course makes them more likely to encounter false information. So the drop in local news is hugely significant here. But the other part of it is that opposing journalists has become a political talking point to a huge degree, to a degree where reporters are constantly attacked, both physically and online. And we can't discount the effect that those types of campaigns against journalism and reporters have overall. So it's a real smorgasbord of a problem that needs all kinds of different approaches to be addressed.
I think this is like an insider baseball question, but I think really interesting for a lot of folks. How do you decide which false claims to debunk and which to ignore when doing your job? So like, what is your, how do you define your standard of like, this deserves a response and this doesn't?
So Jane, why don't I start and then you can fill in, because we could be here for a while. A couple of the things that, or a few of the things that I like to consider, because I mean, that question is based on this idea that, you know, are we unnecessarily going to amplify something, right? And I think that's always the concern. So one of the things I look at is harm. Does this claim have the potential to cause harm? Does it need to be down? And so if someone is saying, if there's a claim out there that drinking bleach might rid your body of the coronavirus, that is something that we want to be on top of. Because, as you know, if that goes viral and that gets a lot of attention, that could be very dangerous. So I really do consider that. And as part of that, I also consider, you know, whether or not it's in the public's interest for me to look at this claim. You know, is there going to be some sort of benefit to people in addressing this? I also look at where the claim is coming from. You know, was it made by a public figure, you know, someone whose like words carry some real weight? Does it need to be addressed because of that? I also think about whether or not I see people, any indication or any kind of clear signs of whether or not people are being deceived by the misinformation. You know, do I see people in comments, for example, who are supporting this and going along with it? That could be something. Of course, I look at how much attention it's getting, and not just on one platform, but its cross-pollination effect. You know, is there a video about it? Is there now a meme? Is it on Twitter? Is it on Facebook? Or does it have the potential to be viral? Does it have the potential to gain a lot of traction? And by that, I mean, like, is it connected to some kind of larger narrative, some kind of larger conspiracy theory? is it something that we've addressed in the past that is now coming back up again that we need to kind of clobber all over? Yeah, I'm sure I'm missing I'm missing a few, but it's a very, very important question. And it's a very delicate calculus that we take into account when we're doing this, because obviously the last thing that we want to do in the kind of job that we have is amplify unnecessarily bad information.
Yeah, yes to all of that. The one thing I'll add is that it's never an individual decision, really, at least in our newsroom. It's almost always a gut check with the entire team, with editors, with other reporters on the beat, because this is not the sort of thing you want to be wrong about.
I will say it is the one conversation I have every single day, all day, from the moment I sign on to the moment I sign off, and probably thereafter. It's something that we address, and it's also something that can change over the course of time, even within like an hour. You know, you could be a hard no at noon, and at 4 o'clock, you're trying to get that story out as fast as you can. So it really can change. It's a very fast evolving field.
So I do want to be mindful of time. We have 2 questions, so maybe we'll do this like a fast one each. One of you takes each. Do either of you have an example of misinformation that even you fell for? So whoever wants to.
Well, I can tell you that the text message I got about an impending national lockdown in New York City, where I live, that was something that gave me pause. I wouldn't say that I fell for it, but it definitely made me stop what I was doing and really look at it. So that's the first thing that pops into my mind.
I will say the Tom Cruise videos, the Tom Cruise deep fakes from last week. I really thought I was losing my mind looking at them. They were very good. That was like a real moment of like, am I awake? Am I dreaming? Is this real? Is this fake? What am I looking for here? It was a real, like, in the moment when I first saw them, I was like, oh no, this is pretty bad. They really were shockingly well done.
Yeah, and the danger there is, of course, if it can be done with Tom Cruise, it can be done with somebody who, you know, has some real power and you know, is maybe leading people.
Let's not go down the rabbit hole. That can be a whole other talk. I have so many thoughts on deepfakes. Endless.
And then our last question is from Raj. He says, how does one debunk or counter so much misinfo and disinfo from sources such as QAnon or Newsmax?
Well, this is essentially what Jane and I do every day, one by one.
If it seems tiring and overwhelming, then yes, that's what it's like. I've been doing this for 4.5 years and have been debunking stuff like this for 4.5 years, as well as investigating. You know, you can't forget the investigations portion of this. And it is difficult, it is tedious, it opens you up to all kinds of attacks and harassment. But, you know, there are suggestions that fact-checking labels work, that debunks work, that filling data voids, so making sure that people have the correct information if they're looking at that works. So small ray of sunshine, I don't know, but it's not a happy job.
I just believe that the one thing I tell myself, and I will say I've never experienced a year like 2020, and I think same for Jane. I mean, that was really very difficult on so many levels, professionally, personally, emotionally. And, you know, I just tell myself that there is a place for accurate information. We have to keep fighting the fight to get accurate fact-based information to people. I just don't think there's anything more important. So that's how I deal with it.
That's a great end. And many people said in the comments, thank you for your work. And I will add that. And is it possible, Karen, for you to share the slides with folks who attended? That would be great. Yeah, we can go ahead and send that along to folks that.
Yeah, I'm totally fine. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just check it with Jane, make sure that everything is annotated properly.
Great. Thank you guys so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. I know it's hard to stare at a screen after an entire day of staring at a screen, but this was extremely public service journalism. So thank you both to Karen and Jane for your work.
Yeah. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Farnoosh. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Have a good
everyone.
night.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Bye.